If you want to follow along, the outline is actually on the app. But we're going to start a series. We're going to talk about generations. And the Bible says in Psalm 145, it says, generation after generation stand in awe of your work. Each one tells story of your mighty acts. In other words, there's a great benefit to us actually doing life together when it comes to multiple generations. Those of us who are in our 70s, our 60s, our 40s, our 30s, our 20s, even those who were born just a month ago. You know, I was conceived in violence, but I was born into a family. And it's in the context of family that I really learned the value of generations, right? I remember my grandpa, my mom's father. They would drive down to Arkansas from Michigan. And I remember my grandpa would always tell me when I was little and I'd get mad and I'd start crying, he'd say, your face is going to freeze that way. And it would make me so angry, right? I wanted to be mad and he was trying to make me laugh. My grandma, on the other hand, she was a very strong lady. And they finally moved to Arkansas. My mom is the youngest of 7 kids. And so they moved down, I guess they had to take care of their daughter there. And my grandma, one Halloween, when me and I got 2 brothers, they're both younger, they lived out in the country, and she was going to kind of do a Halloween thing for us. So she took one of those old cardboard tied boxes, and she put eyes in it and a nose in it. Then she put a flashlight in it, and then she put a sheet over it. And then she stuck it on a mop handle. And we pulled up to her house out there in the middle of nowhere where it was completely dark. And she lifted that up, and we couldn't see her. It looked like a ghost flowing through the woods. And she ran all over those woods trying to entertain and scare me and my brothers. My uncle, my grandma's oldest son, Lyle Everingham, was the CEO and the chairman of the board of the Kroger Grocery Company. And in the little town we grew up on, we had a grocery store. And I remember one summer, my grandma took me into Kroger. She asked for the manager. She said, this is my grandson, and you're going to hire him today to work here. She was very clear. I remember later in life, after my grandpa had died, she moved up to Michigan again. And Steph and I, we were married, and God had nudged my heart towards ministry at the time. And we went up to see Grandma, and she said, well, if you're going to be a pastor, you have to have a suit. So she bought me my first suit and a pair of shoes. When I was little, I got real sick, and they gave me some medicine that messed up my teeth. And so she said, well, if you're going to be a preacher, you got to get your teeth fixed. So we went up to see my grandma, and she made an appointment for me at the dentist, and she took me to Nordstrom's to take care of me. I learned the value of those who have gone before you actually pouring into your life. My dad's dad I only met one time. He was an incredible alcoholic. He was so addicted that he would drink rubbing alcohol to try to get some kind of fix or some kind of high. His wife, my dad's mother, was scared of storms. And if it started to thunder, she would call, and Mom would go pick her up, and she would come over, and she would spend the night. I look back now as a grandparent, and I can't believe what me and my brothers did. We called my mom's mom New Grandma. And we called my dad's mom, guess what? Old Grandma. Now, we didn't do it to be mean, but now I look back and I think, man, I wouldn't want to be old Grandpa. I'd much rather be new Grandma. But there's incredible power. There's a gift when it comes to generations. And there's a great story we can learn from. It's in Luke chapter 2. And it's a story about Jesus, his mom Mary, and his dad Joseph, his earthly dad, you might say. And it was time for them to go to the Passover festival. And so Jesus, his mom, and his earthly father load up along with the friends and neighbors, and they go from Nazareth to Jerusalem. They get there, they have the celebration, they get back, in their vehicle, and they start the journey home, only to realize that Jesus is not with them. They don't know where he's at. They've went a whole day down the road. So they have to turn around, go back to Jerusalem. You can imagine they're freaking out, right? Have you ever lost your child in Walmart? I mean, I'm sure you haven't. You're good parents, but some people do that from time to time. They were freaking out. Took them 3 days in Jerusalem to find Jesus. Where was he? Of course, he was hanging out with the religious leaders. And in that text, we really learn something about doing life generationally. I put it in your outline like this. There's what I would call the native generation, and there's what I would call the next generation. Basically, you have the younger and the older, but nobody wants to be called older, so I just said native. In other words, they've been around for a while. Those two generations have the capacity to come together and actually create the now generation. There's responsibilities for the native generation, those who have been around for a while, and the next generation, those who are younger. And in this text, we learn those. And I want to share them with you really quickly as we begin this series. Because if we can grab a hold of this, we can literally change our culture. When it comes to the native generation, those who have been around for a while, there's a responsibility and value in the older generation. The Bible teaches us, first of all, if you want to jot this down, is that we have the responsibility to model and teach commitment. The Bible says in verses 41 and 42, it says, every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem from the Passover festival. When Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as what? What's that next word? As usual. Right? They were consistent. They did life with a sense of rhythm. And one of the responsibilities and value that the older generation adds is this consistency, is this sense of commitment. Because we live in a culture that often is unwilling to commit to anything. And yet, as a native generation, we have an opportunity to step up and then model that and bring value. Because without commitment, you can't make progress. A lot of people spend their whole life doing what? Just kind of going in circles, right? I'm all fired up. I see it spiritually all the time as a pastor. You probably see it in your business. Woo, I love Jesus. Yes, I do. They're hot, on fire for Jesus, and then they kind of drift away, and then they'll come up to shake my hand and they'll say, I'm back. Yeah. And they're back for a few months, and then they're gone again. And then they're back again. They never actually make progress. Why? Not because they're bad people, they're just uncommitted. And one of the values that you as a native generation, I might say, can bring is the importance of commitment. Because it's not just at the Passover. In verse 21 of the same chapter, it says, 8 days later, when Jesus was just 8 days old, he was circumcised. It says in verse 22, then it was time for their purification offering, as required by law of Moses after the birth of the child. So the parents did what? They went to Jerusalem when he was just a baby. Over and over again, they modeled for Jesus and everyone else around them the importance of commitment and the impact that commitment can have. I learned commitment from my mom. I've got 2 younger brothers. My dad, when we were growing up, he didn't go to church. But my mom took us every weekend. She would get me and my 2 younger brothers, and we're close together. We're like a year apart. So when I was 5, my brother was like 4, and the other one was like 3.5. And every Sunday, my mom would get all 3 of us up. She'd get all 3 of us dressed. She'd put all 3 of us in the car, and she'd take all 3 of us to the church. And it didn't matter if it was raining. It didn't matter if it was summer, if it was winter. It didn't matter if we had a ball game the night before. We were going to go to church. And I learned from my mom the value of commitment. And part of the reason that I'm standing before you today, and I have an incredible wife and amazing children, is not because I'm awesome. It's because of what my mom modeled and taught me when I was a kid. I learned the commitment of work ethic from my father. My dad did everything. He was an entrepreneur. We had a sporting goods store. He had a newspaper business. He did physical labor. And I'll never forget one evening he came home and he had dropped a manhole cover on both of his big toes and broke them. And the next morning, he got up and cut the ends of his shoes, work boots out, and went to work. And I learned from him that the commitment to get up and do what you're supposed to do, to work. My dad told me, because, again, he would do physical labor, and I worked with him once when I was a teenager during the summer, and he did plumbing was one of the things that he would do. And if you've ever put in like a toilet or something and you have to get down like this, well, I would get down like this if I was going to work on it. You might as well get comfortable if you're going to be there for a while. And Dad's like, you never sit down, right? You gotta be up. You gotta be ready. He told me to go get the wrench, and I just kind of go get the wrench. He said, no, you got to walk. If you're going to do something, you need to get there and you need to do it. I learned that from my father, an incredible gift that another generation has given to me. Right? When it comes to our kids, as I talked to you a little bit earlier about giving, one of the things that Steph and I have really worked hard at doing is to teach our children the value and the importance of being generous in all areas of their lives. So if you're here and you're a part of the native generation, part of the older generation, you have incredible value and responsibility. And it's not just to your children, but it's to that whole younger generation. Whether it's somebody you work with, somebody that you teach, but it's to bring that value to our culture. My goal is not that people would walk out of this door feeling guilty. My goal, this is the way I wrote it down, this is not about guilt, but it is about saying, beginning today, we can create a now generation. I can add value. The second thing we learn from this text is to lead always and discipline when necessary. You notice in verse 42, once again, it says, when Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual. Notice it did not say they went to Jesus and said, hey, do you want to go to the festival this year? They said, Jesus, we're going to the festival. Get dressed, get ready, we are going. That we're going to discipline, you might say. We're going to lead you to do the things that are important. We've got camp. You heard about camp just a little bit earlier. I can promise you, our kids, there were times like 13. If you're a parent and you haven't had a 13-year-old yet, God help you, all right? But there were times when our kids didn't want to go to camp. They didn't want to go over there to student ministry, but they didn't have a choice. And the reason they didn't have a choice is because as the older generation, as the parent of that child, I was going to choose what was best for them. I was going to do it in love. I didn't want to push them away. You got to be wise in doing that, but you got to lead in doing that. Allowing a 10-year-old to decide, and listen to me, kids lie. Look, I'm going to tell you, some of you have fallen for a lie they've told you. They like to listen to me preach. Sometimes they'll come up to me and say, oh, they don't go to the children's ministry because they just love to hear you teach. I'm like, no, they don't. No, they don't. What they love is they don't have to engage at the level in here that they do over there. And it's not because you have a bad child or a bad teenager. It's because we have an adversary that's like a roaring lion that wants to destroy your children. That's the reality. And I'm just telling you, you don't have to do what I do or what Steph did, but this is what Mary and Joseph did when it came to Jesus. They said, we're going. Get ready. Now, you got to be careful when you do this because it also teaches us not to make assumptions. Look what happens in verse 43 and 44. It says, after the celebration was over, they started home from Nazareth. But Jesus didn't go. He stayed in Jerusalem. His parents didn't miss him at first. They assumed he was with them. Look what it says, verse 44. But they assumed he was among the other travelers. But when he didn't show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. Jesus' parents made the assumption that Jesus was with them, when in reality, Jesus wasn't. As somebody who's been in ministry for a long time, here's what breaks my heart more than anything, especially in 2023, is that there are a lot of us as Christian parents who have good kids. But if you were to sit down with your kids at the dinner table and talk about worldviews, you would be amazed at how far off their worldview is from a Christian worldview. And there are good Christian public school teachers in this world, but the culture is pushing in the opposite direction of everything this Bible teaches. And remember, Jesus teaches so that you may have life and you may have it abundantly. There's a correlation between what the culture is teaching and the suicide rate amongst young people. And you and I know, right? It's not bad, evil young people that are taking their own lives. It's hurting and confused young people with the wrong worldview. Don't make the assumption. See, I see that all the time. See, you think because you're a Christian and your kids are good kids that they believe the same thing you do. And so you can come once a month or every other month and everything will be okay because you got good kids. But what you don't realize is that they're not getting a Christian worldview. 30 days out of the month, the culture is pushing them in the opposite direction of God. And our worldview ends up impacting our life in an incredibly big way. And I can't tell you how many parents, one after the other, one day wake up and they're like, man, how did this happen? What took place? It's because like Mary and Joseph, we make an assumption. Jesus they traveled a whole day. You and I can get way down the road before we turn around and realize that our children are going in the wrong direction and that the enemy wants to do everything within his power to destroy it. Because we just made an assumption. We forgot that the church, what's the church's goal? Is to partner with you and your child so that they can reach their potential and impact the world. It's not to be the parent, it's to partner with the parent. But when it happens, and it probably will happen in some capacity in all of your lives as a parent or just someone from the older generation, is that you have to take the time to go back and rescue them. You can't give up on them, right? Look what happens in verse 44. It says, instead, they thought Jesus was somewhere in the caravan, right? So they went a day's journey, and then they began looking for him, and they're like, whoa, where is he? They're freaking out. Verse 45, and when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. And then after 3 days, they found him in the temple. In other words, they went back and they said, we're not going to leave you. We're going to go back and we're going to rescue Jesus. We're going to bring him back into the caravan. And when you and I, as part of the older generation, the native generation, realize that we've made some assumptions about young people that aren't true, we got to go back and rescue them. Not give up on them, not talk badly about them, right? That's the easy thing to do. Maybe you're 65 years old and you're one of those greeters at Walmart and there's a 22-year-old there that makes fun of you, that is arrogant, prideful, and everything in you wants to give up on them, wants to get angry at them. No. We need to go back and rescue that young person. We need to not give up on that young person, right? We got to give the time to go back. So if you're part of the native generation, however you want to define that, we got to model commitment and consistency. It's what we get to add to the culture. We got to lead always, discipline when necessary. And then maybe this is the most challenging for those of us who are part of the native generation, is to listen and hear the next generation. Look what happens in verse 46. It says 3 days later, they finally discovered him in the temple. He's sitting among the religious leaders, listening to them, asking questions. Look what it says in verse 47. All who heard him. So Jesus, as a 12-year-old, is talking to the religious leaders, were amazed at his understanding and his answers. You can't let insecurity keep you from actually listening to the younger generation. They don't have the experience that you do. They don't have the wisdom that you do. But that doesn't mean that God can't use them to teach you something. That same 22-year-old dude or dudette that works at Walmart, that son or daughter, and that kid on the team that you coach, right? The scripture is reminding us that we need to listen so that both generations can come together and create a now generation See, young people think that nobody's listening to them because they're too young. And older people think that nobody's listening to them because they're too old. And as a result, nobody's listening to one another. Everybody's trying to convince somebody else to listen to them. And what we really need to do is to learn from one another. That's the reason God's given us this gift. And what a day in which to live. People are living longer today than they have in modern history. It's a great opportunity to succeed in ways those who have gone before us didn't have the opportunity to do so because they didn't have the gift of generations alive at the same time. All right, let me give you the next generation real quickly because we see it in this same text as well. Your responsibility if you're a part of the younger generation, the next generation, and the value that you add. First of all, is to be curious and to challenge the norm, the status quo. Remember, we read it in verses 46. It says, 3 days later, they discover him. He's in the temple. He's sitting with religious leaders. And he's listening to them, and he's doing what? He's asking questions. He's challenging the status quo. He's asking, why? Why? Why do we do that? Why is that the best way? See, if you're part of the native generation, the older generation, here's what our tendency is. Our tendency is because we've had success at some point in our life doing something. And when all of a sudden that's not succeeding anymore, we tend to look back on history and think, well, the problem is we just need to do what we were doing when we succeeded better. When in reality, maybe you need to do something different. And because you're a part of the native generation, you can't see it. But God's given you what? God's given you that arrogant teenager on your baseball team. He's given you that coworker that's 25 at the office. He's given you that son, that daughter, that grandchild to be able to speak into your life so that you can see things different by the questions that they ask. And if you're that young person, then you have to have the courage to ask the question, to challenge the status quo. We talk about digital evangelism. That's one of the things that we're running after in this next Temple Centurion season. It's in that pack of cards that we gave you. You know, see, during COVID, there were a lot of churches that were completely unprepared for COVID. They couldn't communicate online, even though the internet's been around for quite a while. But they were just kind of slow in adapting. And as a result, today, they're not meeting because they couldn't communicate with their congregation during COVID, and so they just didn't survive. They just didn't last. Why? Well, because if you were to go visit many of those churches, they would all be of the same generation. And they were of the same generation for one of two reasons. They wouldn't listen to the younger generation, or the younger generation didn't have the courage to ask the question why and challenge the status quo. And say, we can't do things the way we're doing. Why are we doing them this way? Or why don't we do it that way? Or what if we were to do it that way? And as uncomfortable as that might be for everybody involved, it's the only way for us to actually progress forward. The only reason we have a band up here is because somebody said, well, why can't we? Why can't we? Why can't we have drums? Or why can't we have a guitar? Or why can't we have all the other stuff? Right? When I grew up, all we had was a piano and an organ. And then somebody said, well, why can't we have some drums? And we're like, well, I don't know. And all that, right? And we find ourselves at a whole different place simply because a younger generation was willing to have the courage and ask the question. Which leads me to number 2. The value and responsibility you have as being a part of the next generation is to live in the now, is to set the culture. In verses 48, it says, his parents didn't know what to think. Son, she says, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantically searching for you everywhere. Look at Jesus. Jesus, but why did you need to search? Didn't you know? Didn't you know where I am? I mean, I'm in my Father's house. This is the now. But they didn't understand. They didn't know what he meant. See, the great thing about being a part of the next generation is you're part of the generation that gets to set the culture. You realize that everybody is listening. If you're here between the ages of 18 and 39, everybody wants to know what you think. They make what you want to buy. They produce the movies you want to go see. They make the food that you want to eat. You have the opportunity and the ability to set the culture. And just like Jesus said, well, why didn't you know where I was? Right? I live in the now. That's the great benefit of being a part of the young culture. You have more power than you realize. I read the other day that Disney is going to have a Pride Night where they're going to put Mickey and Minnie and all the rainbow colors and all of that. And you think, now why in the world would Disney have a sexual preference night when it's supposed to be the happiest place on earth for children? Well, why would they have any kind of sexual night if they're the happiest place in the world for children? I'll tell you why. Because if you're here between the ages of 18 and 39, they think that's what you want. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't. See, you're the one who have the kids, and they assume you'll support that. You have an incredible amount of power, and with that comes responsibility to have the courage to set the culture. Right? Now, you have to have courage because the older generation, can I tell you something about the older generation? They love to hang on to power. It's hard to give up power. It's hard to, and so you have to have the courage to not only ask the question why, but also the courage to set the culture. Let me give you this last one, and this is probably the most challenging one, is you also have to be willing to then submit to your elders. Look at what it says in verse 51. It says, then, right, Jesus challenges the status quo. Jesus sets the culture, right? He's living in the now. So why are you looking for me? Here, you should know, here's where I am. This is what's going on in our world. He says, but then he returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. His mother, Mary, she stored all these things in her heart, and then Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with both God and people. Right? There's that moment where you have to then, right, you're pushing against asking the question, courage to set the culture. And then there comes that moment where you have to say, okay, rather than rebel, I'm going to submit. And in submitting, I'm trusting that God is the one who's going to open the doors in the future. See, when you submit to authority, you immediately make the person in authority responsible for the decision that they're making. God holds them then accountable to make that decision. And God says that he will bless. He says that's what Jesus did. He says that's what children are supposed to do to their parents. He says that what we're supposed to do to those who are in authority over us. Never easy to do, but it's the right thing to do. So that these generations can come together and create a now generation. It changes the culture, make a difference in the world. Would you bow your head? I want to read to you the verse we started with. Psalm 145, verse 4. Just listen to it. One generation will praise your works to another. So it's one generation talking to another generation about how great God is. Before I pray, look this way. I've been thinking about this. Potential Church is 45 years old. Did you know that? In 55 years, it's going to be 100 years old. I'm not going to be here, but many of you will. You'll be around. You'll get to celebrate 100 years. I wonder what kind of church it will be? Will the 100-year celebration just be, we lasted, we survived, we're still here? Here's what I wrote in my journal. My prayer is that that day would dwarf this day. That we're laying the foundation so that 100 years from now, Potential Church will be seeing its greatest days to impact the culture in a positive way for God's kingdom. God, may it be so. Help us to be a now generation. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.